It is now my pleasant duty to welcome our opening speaker, who is going to set the agenda for the day, Professor Peter Saunders. Professor Saunders will be known to many of you. He was Director of the Social Policy Research Centre at the University of New South Wales until 2007. He's still there now as the Research Chair. But many of us, I think, will remember him in terms of his books, The Ends and Means of Welfare, Coping with Economic and Social Change in Australia, The Poverty Wars, Reconnecting Research with Reality, and Social Science and Public Policy in Australia. He's been a prominent researcher in the field of inequality for many years and pursued these issues. Would you welcome Professor Peter Saunders? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for inviting me to this very important day. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And my job today is to set the scene for what promises to be a very interesting day. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the papers. And I'm going to talk about the extent of inequality in one dimension only, which is income. I'll make some reference to other things, but what I really want to try and do is to get people connected a bit more with what inequality actually means for them, for people like us. I can recall when, many years ago, when I had just published a paper on income distribution in Australia, meeting one of my economist friends who said to me, Peter, I see you've just shown that income inequality has increased again. What wonderful news. And I mention that because although everyone in this room might well think that inequality is bad and we need less of it, there are lots and lots of people out there who don't think that. And if there's going to be a debate about inequality in Australia, I think we need to engage more with the issue and understand it more. And that's what I'm going to try and do in the next half an hour or so. I've got way too many slides. So as time goes on, I'll probably skip through them, but I think they'll all be available afterwards. So let me start. And I'll talk through the slides and let you read them rather than going through them piece by piece until I get to some of the tables where there are things I want to highlight. So Mary's already set the scene. Inequality is now an issue. Lots of people who previously thought nothing about it now think it's an issue that needs addressing. And there are some very prominent members of this group, the United Nations, even the World Bank, the OECD, the European Commission, and at the bottom, UNICEF. Now, I'll just mention that in 2015, let's try and get this pointer working. It was going a minute ago. Maybe I'll have to go over and point.
No, hang on, we've got an IT person here.
Ah, right, okay.
So it's just that one there.
It's that one there, is it?
No,
But I don't want to change it, I want to point.
oh, point.
The red. It was working. Not working? No, okay. So I'm going to occasionally wander over here and point to things. Can people still hear me? Can people still hear me if I come here? Okay, good. I wanted to just, sorry, I've gone, my email has moved me.
Here we are. Yes, that's a good idea.
I think I can shout. Oh, okay. Sorry. Put that in my pocket. Just wanted to mention that in 2015, Australia and almost every other country in the world signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those says that between now and 2030, the income of the bottom 40% must increase at a faster rate than the average. That means the income share of the bottom 40% must increase between now and 2030, and we'll be held to that. And I can tell you that we haven't achieved that in the last decade or in the last 2 decades. So Australia is not on track to achieve that particular goal. Equality of outcome is what I'm going to talk about, but there's lots of discussion about, well, it's not really outcomes that matter, it's opportunities. It's giving everyone the equal starting point for everybody. And if some do better than others, well, that's the nature of capitalism. Well, the first point to make about this is that outcomes and opportunities are not independent of each other. Both are important. And there's a quote there from Tony Atkinson, one of the leading economists in this field, who very sadly died earlier this year, about the need, if you're interested in inequality of opportunity, you need to address inequality of outcome. And that's very important. And the rest of this slide just presents some information, which I think is very important in this context, about the impact of inequality today on children's participation in education. Essentially, the further up the income distribution you are, the richer you are, the more likely you are to have your children going to tertiary education, and therefore the more likely they are to also end up further up the income distribution. Education is absolutely critical. And at the bottom here you can see there's some research done on the relationship between the father's education and the likelihood that his children will also go through a university or tertiary education. And that ratio varies enormously across the OECD, from 9 to 1 in countries like Italy and Poland, and from close to 1 to 1 in Finland. Australia, by the way, ranks 12th out of 22 countries. So about in the middle, nothing to write home about in terms of that particular story. Okay, so let's move on now to start talking about inequality. Here's a very rough first picture. Sorry. The Gini coefficient. We've all heard of the Gini coefficient. Probably none of us really understand what it is. But the first point I want to make about the Gini coefficient is that you can estimate the Gini coefficient for any distribution. We could take the distribution of the height of people in this room, and we could work out the Gini coefficient. Not a very interesting measure of inequality. And the point about the Gini is that not only a statistical measure in itself, but it's very important to decide what the distribution is you're measuring. And of course, Mr. Morrison, our treasurer, made a very foolish remark a few weeks ago, talking about a Gini in relation to an income variable that no one in their right mind would ever regard as a sensible measure of inequality. But because it was a Gini, he thought it had some status. And that is the latest income Gini for Australia, 0.333. That's for year 2013-14, a long time ago. That's the latest information we have. The ABS, and I'm going to be talking mainly about ABS data today, was due to release its latest income survey on Tuesday this week. I had all my slides ready to be changed to incorporate the new numbers, and on Tuesday the ABS announced it had ran into problems and was deferring the release until September. I can't think of an occasion in the last 10 or 20 years where that hasn't happened. But it's interesting that the latest we can talk about today in 2017 about income distribution is what was happening 3 or 4 years ago. That in itself, I think, is quite revealing about the priority, not that the ABS accords this issue, but what the government who funds the ABS accords to this particular issue. Has the Gini gone up? Well, that's the best information that we can pull together on this. The blue line is work done by the Melbourne Institute about 10 years ago, and the red line is the information I've taken from the available ABS data. There's a big change in the way ABS conducted these surveys here. That's why I put them both in. Now, no one in their right mind could look at that graph, I think, and say that it isn't increasing. It's true you could pick periods where you could claim it's gone down or it stayed the same, but over that period for which we have data, it's unambiguously gone up. Is that a significant increase? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but Tony Atkinson has suggested, and as I said, he's or was the world's leading expert on this, that an increase in the Gini coefficient of 3 percentage points is big enough for you to say that that increase is notable, or salient is the word he uses. And an increase of 0.3 occurred between 1980 and the mid-90s, and another increase occurred between the mid-90s and the latest year. So if you go back 1 or 2 decades, over both of those periods, we have had a notable increase in income inequality. The trend is up. Now, here's a graph. I just want to introduce this. This is looking at, this is drawn from the latest ACOS inequality report that I and my colleagues produced the numbers for. And this is income distribution in 2011-12. We're in the process of discussing an update of this, but of course we're now hampered by the ABS not knowing when the latest data is coming out. But I introduce this because most people present income distribution measures in terms of what are called deciles. And the deciles are derived by, imagine ranking everybody in the whole population from the poorest to the richest, and then splitting the population into groups of 10 equal-sized groups. They're called deciles, and this graph shows the income share of each decile. So the lowest 10% had 3% of the income, and the highest 10% had about 24% of the income, 8 times as much. Okay. Now, let me just stop for a minute to say this is for the economy as a whole. Okay. Now, in the figures, if you look at the ABS figures and you blow them up to represent the whole population, which is what the figures are based on, and we're talking here about 22 million, just under 9 million households containing 22 million people. So each decile contains 2.2 million people. Okay? And this is representing all of the income of all of those individuals. Men, women, children in some cases, unemployed, retired, working, living off their savings, all sources of income for everybody in the population. And we collapse the variability in all that income across the whole of Australia into one statistic, the Gini coefficient, 0.333. We ask a lot from that statistic, right? We're asking a lot. Imagine trying to work out the variability of income in this room. We started that today, we'd still be here in a month's time arguing about how to measure it. We can happily do it for 22 million people. Okay, so now let's ask, where do people think they fit in the distribution? This is a question I ask my colleagues, some of whom know as much or more about income distribution than I do. Imagine the population split into 10 equal-sized groups going from poorest to richest. Where do you think you fit? We've asked this question in 1999, in 2006, and in 2010, and I have a survey in the field at the moment asking it again. And this is the 2010 data. And you see that almost everybody thinks they fit in the middle. Now, by definition, since there are 10 equal-sized groups, the graph should look like this. It should be 10% in each decile. 85% of the Australian population think they fit in the middle 4 deciles. That number has hardly changed. It's almost exactly the same in 1999, in 2006, and in 2010. Now, that means a couple of things. One, I think we knew this. We all think we're Middle Australia. So when politicians talk about this policy will appeal to Middle Australians, the reason they say that is because everyone thinks they're Middle Australians, so if it's going to benefit the middle, I'm in there. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that people think of the poor and the rich as people other than them. So when you ask people, what do you think has been happening to the gap between the rich and the poor? they're talking in there about two groups that they think they have no experience of. It also implies that lots of people who think they're here are actually in here, and lots of other people who think they're here are actually in there. And if you ask yourself, I'm going to give you a table in a minute, so you can go through it for yourself and figure out where you might fit. I think that might be the next one. So this is where do people actually fit. This is a very complicated thing to answer, and I'm going to have to talk you through this, if I may. When the income distributions are presented by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they don't measure the distribution of income, as we understand it, dollars. They measure the distribution of what's called equivalised income. Equivalised income is income adjusted for the needs of the household. So a family with two children requires more income than a single person in order to achieve the same standard of living. So if you want to compare the incomes of those two groups, you have to make an adjustment. And these are the adjusted income levels after tax that define the different deciles. This is in 2011-12. So if you had an income of less than $383 a week after tax, adjusted for your household size, you were in the bottom decile. If you had an income between that and that, you were in the second decile, and so on. Okay. Now, first thing I've done is I've updated it by the CPI. I've not allowed for any changes in inequality, but just CPI to give us a rough and ready measure. Now, these are the amounts that would define which decile you fell in if you're a single person. Okay? But if you're a couple, I now have to unravel the adjustment for the needs and give you more income. Not twice as much, actually only 1.5 times as much because of economies of scale. So now, the way to look at this diagram is to look across here to see whether which of these best captures your situation. Okay? And then go down the column until you find the disposable income of your household, you and anyone else who gets any money. And that's where you sit in the district. That's the decile in which you sit. I'll give you an example. Someone on average weekly earnings, full-time, average weekly earnings in May 2017 after tax was about $1,200 a week. So a single worker on average weekly earnings in 2017 would be in this column and would be in the 8th decile. Now, average weekly earnings put you near the top of the distribution. Now, imagine that this worker, male or female, has a partner. Then they move from this column to this column, and they move back to the 5th decile. Okay? Because now there are 2 males to feed, not 1. So the 1,200 now puts you here. They have a child, and they move down again. They have 2 children, and move down yet again. And if they have 3 children, they end up in the 2nd decile. So you can move from the 8th to the 2nd decile without any income changing. Okay, the income is completely unchanged. You've just got a bigger family. And the ability of that income to meet your family needs is obviously declining. So if you happen to be receive one of my surveys for 2017, and we ask this question, where do you fit in the income distribution? You will be able to give me a very precise answer now. Okay, so let me move on now to look at the top. So here I'm drawing on some analysis I did a few years ago, 2009-10 income distribution. But the income distribution in that year was very similar to 2013-14. So the story I want to tell is similar today. It's probably more dramatic today. This is the way that the ABS would present this information. They use weekly equivalised individual after-tax dollars. And these are the income levels that define which decile you fit in. So less than about 300, you're in the bottom decile, and more than about 1,400, you're in the top. Okay? But of course, equivalised deciles, if I asked anyone in this room, what is your equivalised household disposable income? You'd throw your conference program at me, and rightly so. It takes people like me quite a long time to work that out. So let's just replace this diagram with real dollars. Inequality is suddenly looking bigger. And the reason for that, of course, is that the people who have incomes up the top here tend to have larger households. So when you adjust for the household size, it brings them back towards the middle. And many of the people down here are single people. So relative to the others, they move up. So it collapses the distribution. So the degree of inequality has changed from that to that by doing nothing other than a statistical manipulation. A sensible one, all economists and people working in this field would say this is a sensible thing to do, but it does make a big difference. Now, let's have a look at this top decile. So this is the top 10% of individuals. As I said before, the population that this data refers to is about 22 million. So in the top decile, there are 2.2 million people up there. So let's have a bit of a closer look at them. And let's now just take the top 10% and let's work out the distribution for them. Well, it's going up, not much, but as you notice that it goes up more dramatically the closer you get to the end. Okay. Now let's take this group, that's the top 1% of the population, and let's split them into 10 deciles and have a look at inequality within the top 1%. Now I've got 220,000 people. You might think this is not very dramatic, but of course I'm doing something very naughty here. Look at the scale on the left-hand side. Oh, sorry. Here's where we start. I have to change the scale to get the diagram on the page. Right? So they look the same, but it's only because I've varied the scale. So let's put them all on the same scale. Here's the bottom 90%. Here's the next 10%, and there's the top 1%. And you can see this tendency for it to go up as you get to the top, however you measure it. Now, another way of looking at this, which is the way inequality was described many, many years ago by a Dutch economist called Jan Pen, is to imagine that your height is proportional to your income. Okay? So what I've done is I've taken these figures and I've converted the incomes of people at different points in the distribution to height. And I've done it so that the person with a median income, the person who sits right in the middle of the distribution, is given the median height of the Australian population. So I've taken the median height of men and women and I've averaged it, and that comes to about 1.7 metres. I must say I still tend to think of height of people in terms of feet and inches. So I'm going to give you the figures in metres and feet and inches so you can choose whatever you want. So here's a person in the median. I give them the median height, and that's 5 feet 7. Now, by the way, let's look at some poor devil down at the bottom, in the bottom decile. How high are they? Well, I'm afraid they are midgets. They're 2 feet 1 inches tall. Someone in the top decile is 14 feet 6, about 2.5 times my height. Go to the 95th, they're up to 18 feet. The top 1%, they're 30 feet. Halfway up that top 1%, they're 37 feet. And when they get right to the top of them, they're 63 feet tall. Now, there are still 8,800 households above that person. And in Penn's description, which is worth reading, it's very old, but it's certainly worth reading, he talks about giants coming into sight at the end of this parade who are 50 miles tall, you know, off the planet because their income can't be captured. Those people, of course, don't answer the ABS survey, so they're not in this data, but they're out there somewhere. So there's another way of thinking about inequality. A little bit more on the Gini coefficient. First of all, we expect a lot from that one statistic. A hell of a lot is going on. The focus is on vertical inequality between rich and poor, and it's only on income inequality. The figures that Mary quoted in the introduction about the 1% and the 70% was about wealth, which raises a whole set of issues I'm not going to get into here. So in theory, people say, well, the Gini can vary between 0 and 1. It's equal to 0 when everyone has exactly the same income. And it's equal to 1 when one person has all of the income. Okay? Now, neither of those situations are anything like realistic. Okay? You can't have a society where one person has all the income because n minus 1 people will die the next day. They have no income. And similarly, no one has ever experienced or suggested that we want a society where everyone has exactly the same income. So the interesting question is, how much does the Gini vary by in reality? And the answer is, if you look at the latest OECD figures, which covers 37 countries, I think, something like that, the lowest Gini is about 0.25 in Iceland, and the highest is about 0.45 in Mexico. So although the theoretical range is 0 to 1, the actual practical range is much smaller in the middle. Okay, so movements in the Gini, like I showed it for Australia in the beginning, are quite substantial. Now they start to look a bit more serious. In fact, the increase in the Gini over that graph I showed you earlier, which was 6 percentage points, is bigger than the Gini between Australia and the US. So since the 1980s, inequality in Australia has increased by more than the difference between Australia and the US is now. Okay, that gives you a much better sense of the magnitude. And again, we rank in the middle. Nothing to shout home about. 23 out of 37, middling performance at best. And of course, the other point to note is that the fact that the Gini varies so much across countries suggests that, and these are countries in the OECD who are all experiencing very similar economic conditions, very similar social conditions, suggests that policy matters. The level of inequality is a policy choice for governments. And if you want to get a clear example of that, have a look at what's happened to Iceland, which suffered a total disaster and a complete collapse of its banking sector in the financial crisis. The Gini coefficient went off the page at the top, but through a series of very radical changes to policy, it's come down, is now the lowest in the OECD. So it can be done, but governments need the political will to do it, and people need to vote for the governments that say they're going to do it, because we don't. Okay. Splitting the cake. So as I said before, the income distribution data we've got covers about 9 million households and over 22 million individuals. If you take, the ABS tells us that the average, I'm now going to be talking in equivalized dollars, by the way. I'll convert to real dollars in a minute. The average across the whole population was just under $1,000 after tax a week, 998. So let's multiply that by the total number of people, and we discover that the income distribution is covering $22.6 billion in total. So 1% of that covers $22.6 million per week. Per week. Now let's imagine, now let's look at the top decile. The top decile has done very well over those last 2 decades we've been talking about. Let's see, their share of the income has gone up by 1.4 percentage points. Let's take 1% of that away from them. So still getting more than everyone else, but we're taking the 1% away from them, and we're going to give it equally to the 80% of people who, sorry, I'm talking about the top quintile, not the top decile, top 20%. Let's take 1% of the income gain they've had and give it equally to everyone else. And if you give that equally to everyone else, you would give every individual, this is adults and children, just over $12 a week. So for a family with 2 adults and 2 kids, that's $50 a week. So if we just moderated the increase of the top 1%, everyone else could have had $50 a week. That's what slicing the cake means. Let's say we took away all of their gain, 1.4%, then we'd all get 1.4% more than $50 a week, which is $70 a week. Okay, the people at the top are still, their incomes are still growing, because the incomes of everyone in Australia has been growing. All we've done is said you're not having, your share is not going to grow. Okay, and that's the kind of fund, that's what that would fund if we did that. So that's one way of thinking at the income that those of us who are not in the top quintile, actually I am in the top quintile, so those of you that are not in the top quintile, that's the kind of income you could expect if we had a government that actually took some of our gain, top quintile, and gave it back. Of course, the economic liberals or the economic rationalists, or whatever you want to call them, would say, oh, no, Saunders is off his head again, you can't do this. Because if we didn't let the people at the top, if we didn't provide incentives for the people at the top to go out there and create jobs and increase productivity and drive the economy, then that income growth wouldn't have happened. So by trying to redistribute, what is the phrase, the politics of envy, if we go down that route, not only will the people at the top not have it, but there'll be nothing coming down. There'll be no trickle down. Well, as Mary said, there is no trickle down. That's what the World Bank and the IMF and the OECD and the European Commission and UNICEF were all saying in that first chart. We doubt that there is any trickle down. In fact, the view now is that inequality is bad for economic growth, not good. Okay, so I'm going to now move from inequality to poverty and social disadvantage. And I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. How am I going for time? Okay?
About 8 minutes.
About 8 minutes, okay. So, first thing I want to say is that people say if you think about poverty in a relative sense, then what you're really talking about is inequality. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. Inequality exists when some people have less than other people. Poverty exists when some people have less than they need. They're very different. So don't fall for that one. The focus in poverty research, interestingly enough, is more on horizontal inequalities than vertical inequality, which is what I've been talking about so far. And the reason is because most people who estimate poverty compare poverty rates across different groups, defined on the basis of age, young versus old, family type, couples versus sole parents, country of birth, Australian versus overseas born, what have you. So the interest and the focus is often on horizontal differences between groups. And the reason for that, I think, is that most people who are in this field are interested in the question, are our social provisions adequate enough? And if they were equally adequate for everybody, for all groups, then you ought to find the poverty rates would be the same for all groups. And the fact that the poverty rates are different is suggesting that the provisions, the social provisions, the social benefits and so on, are not equally adequate for everybody. And most of the work that's been done in this field, and I've contributed much to it, is what's called poverty line studies, where we take people's income, we use the same data that I've been describing, the ABS income survey data, And we ask the question, is a family's income or a household's income below a poverty line for that household? If it is, you're poor, and if it's not, you're not poor. And we work out how many are below the line as a percentage of the population, and that gives us the poverty rate. And we can do that for everybody, or we can do it for different groups and compare to different groups. Now that approach is still seen as important. Nothing I'm about to say suggests that I think we should abandon the use of poverty lines, but it's limited. It's limited for two reasons, really. One is that there's more to life than income, even more to people's living conditions than their income. Wealth is a factor that's very important, and as you'll see in a minute, this can make a big difference for people who have a lot of certain kinds of wealth, older people. The other problem is we've never managed to reach any serious agreement about where the poverty line is set. So most people accept that the poverty line is set arbitrarily. We all tend to use, thank you, we all tend to use the same poverty line, but we're always conscious that it's a relatively arbitrary decision and can make a big difference. So the trend in this area of research has been to move away from this income-based approach and develop what's called the deprivation approach. And the deprivation approach asks a different question. Poverty line studies ask the question, is somebody's income adequate? Okay, where adequate is defined by the poverty line, whereas a living standards approach asks the question, is the living standards that this person or household can achieve acceptable? Are they achieving a standard of living that we as a community would regard as acceptable? Now, the way we try and identify what's acceptable is we identify a list of basic items that we think everyone ought to have. I'll show you what the items look like in a minute. And we then ask, in the surveys that I've been talking about, a random sample of the population, do you think that each of these items is essential for all Australians? Not for you, but for Australians. Things that no one in Australia should have to go without today. That's the wording we use in our question. And we then only identify those items that a majority of the community think are essential. More than 50% have to agree it's essential for it to be included in the analysis. And we then, in the same survey, ask people, do you have the item? Yes or no? And if you don't have the item, is it because you can't afford it or because you don't want it? And we define deprivation as existing where people don't have and can't afford items that at least 50% of the population think everyone should have. And that's the deprivation approach in a nutshell. And I'll move on to look at some figures. I've been conducting surveys of deprivation going back for over a decade now, but I managed to persuade the people who run the Hilda survey to include a special module on deprivation in the 2014 Hilda survey. And here are some of the results from that survey. It's going to go in, the plan is it's going to go in the survey every 4 years from now on. So not every year, but we've got it every 4 years, which is good. And these are the items. This one, unfortunately, some of the key items are right on the crack. Dental treatment when needed, up to $500 in emergency savings. I've highlighted in red the ones where deprivation rates are highest. And one feature of those is risk protection, protection against unforeseen events. And lots of people aren't able to afford that protection, so they're on the margins. They may not be below the poverty line, they might be hovering just above it, but any minor crisis, the fridge breaks down, the car breaks down, suddenly need a unexpected health cost, will push them down. Some of the numbers might seem quite small, but the 22 million people, 1% of 22 million people is 220,000. So over 200,000 people can't afford medical treatment. Half of that number have the medical treatment and then can't afford to buy the medication they've been prescribed. Similar number are going hungry. Now, I've got to finish very quickly, so now I'm going to whip through the slides and just go to one that I think reveals something quite interesting. I mean, the obvious question to ask is, does the deprivation approach produce different results to if we just use the poverty line approach? Answer, yes. Here's an example. These are poverty rates by age. The blue is the poverty line approach. Poverty's high amongst youth, pretty low in working age, and then rockets up during after about age 50, 55. We use a deprivation approach, get much more problem in youth, more of a problem in middle age, and much less of a problem amongst older people. Now, there are many possible explanations for this, and I won't go into them here, I don't have time, but we can take them up in discussion if you like. The point is, the approach makes a difference. And you could imagine the policy implications of these two approaches in terms of who should be getting benefits are quite different. In some of the work we've been doing, I'm just going to summarise now, finish. We've been looking at which of these best measures people's express levels of life satisfaction. Answer, deprivation does a much better job of doing that than income poverty. You can apply the deprivation approach to children. So when we estimate child deprivation, we base it on what adults say are essential items for children. You can ask children themselves that. We did a survey, we're analysing survey data of a survey of 3,000 school children in New South Wales, between the ages of 11 and 17, where we apply the deprivation approach to them to understand what deprivation looks like from their perspective, not from what adults think their perspective is. Do children have the same view as adults on which items are essential? No, nothing like it. I've got a slide on that, but I probably don't have time to show it. I'm working with people in Hong Kong where we've done a deprivation survey where we've asked adults and children in the same household about the deprivation questions. And we can not only look at the difference between adults and children, but we can look at the difference between siblings. Do siblings in the same household have the same views about what's essential, and do they report the same levels of deprivation? All sorts of fascinating developments can come out of the deprivation approach. So I think I'm probably giving you enough statistics to drive everyone fairly mad. I think I'll stop. I don't think I need to conclude, but I'm happy to answer some questions if we have a bit of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We now have two, as we're recording this, people who wish to ask questions will need to speak into a microphone. Ayana is on that side and Stephanie is here on this side. So if you'd like to put your hands up, if you'd like to ask a question, we'll get a microphone to you and I'm sure Peter will be happy to answer them. Yes, down the back there.
Are your statistics based on reported taxable income or is it actual income after the...
No, the ABS income surveys ask people to record their income. So it's not taken from the tax statistics as such, although with some components of income, particularly for people who are self-employed, they're often asked to go and refer back to their tax records just to check that the information they provide is accurate.
So,
but it's not tax statistics at all. No.
Yeah, but so the actual inequality could be even higher if you were looking at how people tax
yeah, I think there is evidence that at both extremes of the distribution, we are not capturing everybody at the bottom end and at the top end. Yeah.
Thank you.
With financialization, household debt has become a much larger factor in basically the reproduction of daily life. I'm just wondering whether the deprivation approach considers the issue of debt and the increasing reliance of households on plastic to basically get by from one month to the next.
Yeah, good question. I think a couple of things I want to say on that. The first thing is that the key question as asked in deprivation is whether or not you can afford something. And of course, how people interpret afford might well vary across groups in the population. This might be one explanation for these results for older people, for example. But if you have a modest level of income but have a huge level of debt, you might well say you can't afford these items, focusing on the problem of your debt, even though your income might leave you above the poverty line. So there is an issue there. I think this may be possible to, well, I think this is an issue we can explore because as I said, the deprivation questions are included in HILDA every 4 years, and they're in the same years as the wealth questions are included in HILDA. Mark Wooden, who runs HILDA, said he'd made that deliberately so that we could look at the relationship between wealth, including debt, of course, and deprivation. We haven't done that yet, but that's kind of on the agenda to do. So we might have a bit more of an answer to that in the future.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's been very interesting. I may have missed it when you were doing the deprivation and the HILDA survey. Did you address people not being able to afford mental health? You had dental and physical, but mental health is a pretty major issue.
No, we didn't include that. We did in the original surveys that we did include access to certain services. I can't remember. I don't think mental health was one of them, but we asked about disability services generally and aged care services and childcare services. And we've dropped those questions out more recently. They certainly didn't make it into HILDA. I can't remember whether they were on the list of questions we put to HILDA, but HILDA chose the questions in the end, not us. I mean, the problem with those questions is when you want to work out deprivation rates, you don't know what to put on the denominator. So you know how many people say they can't afford this, but you don't know what to express them as a percentage of. So, I mean, you could obviously have a go. But the problem is, I think, that many people who answer the surveys have no experience of those things either. So we're trying to include in the surveys items that everyone has direct experience with one way or another, so they can give a kind of informed response. It would be possible to tailor the questions to particular groups, but I think the aggregate approach we've taken is best if we leave it to items that have general relevance, as it were. I see you gritting your teeth, and yeah, okay, I share that concern.
We'll take a question over there and a question here. Right, yes.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Ian. Fascinating, absolutely. I'll be rushing out to buy your book.
Oh, thank you.
About the reconciliation of research and reality. My question, though, is on the statistics in relation to the social disadvantage. On the chart, a secure home, I was extremely surprised. It was only 0.3. And of course, having had kids and grandkids, new school clothes, 6.7, school trips, 2.1. They're fascinating, but the question of our time is housing problems, and I'm surprising that it didn't show up in that research, because the reality where I am, down on the Gold Coast, is certainly not expressed in any figures. Yeah,
that's a fair point, and it's worth spending a little bit of time on that. I mean, when we did the first survey, we spent a lot. Of course, these surveys that we ran are mail-out surveys. So we send out we draw a sample of 6,000 people from the electoral roll and send them out the questionnaire. And in the Malart survey, questions have to be relatively simple and short. And we spent a long time debating what the question about housing, what form it should take. And we agreed a decent and secure home. People from ACOS were very supportive of that, and I thought it was a reasonable question. And I should say, I didn't mention this in the, I glossed over this in the presentation, because I'm still thinking about it, but their Hilda results, the deprivation results I showed in that slide, are much lower than the deprivation results we find in our survey. So in our survey in 2010, the household question, there's something like 7%. It's just under 7% compared to, I think it was less than 1% in that slide. Now, we're still thinking about why, well, there are two explanations for this. One, deprivation dropped dramatically in Australia between 2010 and 2014. Not much evidence for that. Two, the way you ask these questions has a big impact on how people respond. And the main difference between our approach and the Hilda approach is that Hilda is a face-to-face interview. And it's possible that in that context, people are less willing to admit to facing deprivations of this kind. And that might be part of the explanation. We're looking into that. That's partly why I glossed over it, because I don't know the answer. But I agree that this looks very low, implausibly low in some regard.
Right, we're on to the last question.
Hi.
But, yes, thank you.
Peter, it seems there's lots of predictions that we're on the verge of robotics taking over and reducing employment. And it seems to me that the people it would hurt are the most in those lower deciles, given that there's pressure to not increase social provision for those people to keep costs down. Is a living wage the solution, or a way to address this, or is there some other way that you would suggest we address this?
Well, I said at the beginning I wasn't going to get into what we should do, and there's someone standing at the back there I think I recognise who probably is going to be able to answer that question. I think that, I mean, the deprivation question, the deprivation results clearly are saying something has to be done. It doesn't necessarily follow from the results that giving additional income to people will solve the problem. The issue is people's lack of affordability, and income is one component of that. So if, for example, people are deprived, I mean, in some of our surveys, people show up as being deprived of adequate public transport in the area. And there's basically no public transport, or there's no public transport after a certain time in the day, so they can't get to the kids' after school activities and so on. Now, giving people more money isn't going to solve that problem. And so I think the deprivation, you can think of the deprivation items either as a proxy for poverty or as items that have legitimacy in their own right. You know, we want to address these issues more directly. Some of them obviously are related to policy, the health ones, the dental care one, which I didn't mention, but the dental one had a very high deprivation rate, and that's because, you know, our public dental system is a disaster, basically. I think income is one way of thinking about it, but I think that the deprivation approach does suggest, to me anyway, that while income is important, and probably the most important core thing that needs to be done, there are other things that need to be done as well. It's necessary but not sufficient.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's been fantastic and set the scene and a frightening day.
Thank you.
We should all be spurred into action.